Good evening. So the feast day of St. Clare was on August 11th, which is this past Friday, but the church allows us to move our patronal feast to the following Sunday so that we can celebrate it together as a community. So that's what we've done, and so the prayers from the Mass are St. Clare, and we are asking her intercession. The gospel passage that we heard is one with which I hope we're very familiar, where Jesus gets away to go and pray, and his apostles decide they're going to go out to sea on the boat, and all of a sudden the seas get rough, and they get scared, and they're afraid, and as if they're not afraid enough, they see this figure walking toward them on the water, and they think, surely it must be a ghost. And Jesus says, do not be afraid, it is I. And Peter, who's always bold and always willing to trust and profess his faith in Jesus, he says, Lord, if it's really you, command me to come out and walk to you on the water. And so that's exactly what he does. And he goes out, right? And he's walking on water, which doesn't make sense because people can't do that, right? We would sink. But Peter's momentarily walking on water, and then all of a sudden he starts to sink, right? It's when he's taken his gaze off of Jesus and he looks at the water, he looks at the wind, he looks around him at the world, and he becomes fearful. And it is then that he begins to sink. Now, we can understand the church as an analogy of the boat, right? It's the bark of Peter, right? Jesus entrusted the church to St. Peter, and so we see the church as this boat being tossed around on the waves and pushed and blown, and sometimes it's nice, steady, tranquil sea, and other times there's all sorts of waves and wind and icebergs and sea monsters and leviathans and all sorts of bad things that are out there in the water. But yet Jesus says, stay in that boat and you're going to be fine, right? It might be turbulent. If you've ever been on a boat when it's really rough seas, especially like on a little small boat, you go out, like deep sea fishing, you can barely stand up. Jesus says, as long as you stay in that boat, you're going to be okay. And so we recognize that we are in this boat, this bark of the church, where God is protecting us and where he is leading us to eternity. He's leading us through the turbulent world that is the sea, and he's leading us to heaven. Now, St. Clare, our patroness, is one who certainly trusted the Lord. She trusted in him so much so that she renounced all that she had in order to follow him. St. Peter, we go back to him, he trusted the Lord there for a brief moment, and then he trusted in himself, or he trusted in the world. He trusted in the fact that he could somehow walk on water, maybe. Or it was that he doubted that God could really care for him. He didn't completely give of himself over. St. Clare, on the other hand, St. Clare gives of herself completely. And she did it at the calling of a preacher who was named St. Francis, that guy. And St. Francis, through his radical preaching of the gospel and through his own rejection of the world and his own profound trust in our Lord, he gave the example to St. Clare to entrust her life to God as well. Now, St. Francis was born into a noble family, and when he decided that he was going to follow God, he heard God's voice. He decided to go into the steps of the piazza there in Assisi, on the steps of the cathedral, and he decided he was going to take all of his clothes off and give them back to his dad and say, I'm going to go live for Jesus now. He was a little, but he was a profoundly holy man. He was a man that led others by his example of radical rejection of the world to doing the will of God. And so St. Clare, in hearing the voice of God as well, through the preaching of St. Francis of Assisi, also from a noble family, decides that she is going to give back all that she has from her wealthy family, and that she is going to reject the world, and that she is going to live a life of poverty, trusting completely in the Lord. Now, religious, Franciscans, Dominicans, etc., they take vows when they, not just like when you're ordained, we make promises to the bishop. We promise obedience to the bishop. We promise celibacy, which means to not get married. And we promise, what's that other one that we promise? Oh yeah, prayer. That one. We promise to pray the Liturgy of the Hours for and with the people of God, as well as to faithfully celebrate the sacrifice of the Mass. But religious, at their religious profession, they make vows. Vows are different from a promise, right? Like at your wedding, you made vows, which mean God is included. You made this vow to God. And so religious profess vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty, chastity, and obedience. And the three of those are known as the evangelical councils of the church, not like a council with an I, like an ecumenical council, but an evangelical council with an E at the end, council. It's confusing. But the evangelical councils that help us to live the gospel, that help us to do the will of God. And so while religious in a special way are called to poverty, chastity, and obedience, really all of the baptized are in some way called to poverty, chastity, and obedience. And we can look to the examples of the saints, St. Francis, St. Clare, and recognize the way in which they modeled living out these counsels. So poverty. None of us here live in poverty. None of us probably, unless our parents were still Depression people, Great Depression people, we probably don't have a clue what poverty is. We live very comfortable lives. And so how is it that we are called to live poverty? How is it that we are called to be impoverished? Perhaps God calls some, like he did Francis and Clare, to go and just say, you know what? I'm getting rid of all my stuff, and I'm gonna live my life for you. This morning we had these religious sisters visiting us from Cedartown. They were selling religious goods because the way that they make their money is basically by begging, because they truly live this vow of poverty whereby they own nothing and they just trust in the providence of God. And so indeed some are called to that. But for us who aren't called to that, to just totally reject stuff. In fact, if you're a family, you really can't do that. You have responsibilities to your family and to your children. But what if perhaps tomorrow your house were to burn down and your car that was in the garage, your nice truck that you love, if you're lucky enough to have a garage, burns down and your golf clubs inside get all burnt up, right? And your TV is burnt and all your cookbooks and all your video games and all your prized possessions, your catcher's mitt from when you were a kid, right? That ball that you hit a home run out of the park and won the Little League game, all that stuff got burnt up. Would you be sad? Probably. Would you be devastated? I don't know. Would you think there's just no hope? I certainly hope not. If we were to lose everything that we had, could we just simply say, well, at least I still have my life? If we were to lose everything that we had and to just be able to go on with our lives and to say, that stuff didn't define me. The stuff that I have, it doesn't define me. The definition, or that which defines me, is that I am a beloved son of the Father. Right? Through my baptism, I have been given this great gift of faith, of love, of salvation. And so therefore, nothing of this world can bring me joy. Nothing of this world, no matter how hard I try, no matter how big my house is, no matter how many houses I have, no matter how many cars or boats or ATVs or other fun stuff I have, it can't really truly bring me fulfillment. Now, that's not to say that it's wrong to have wealth or it's wrong to have stuff. Certainly there's a point of excess, especially if there's not kind of a commensurate charitable aspect as well. You think of all the great philanthropists, right? And they did wonderful things. They gave away money to start universities and build churches. You think of all the old churches in Europe, right? The cathedrals, like the Duomo in Milan. It's magnificent. You look at this thing, and it took them like 4 centuries to build. And you look, and you're like, could we do that today? Even if we tried? Do we have the tools and the knowledge to do it? Certainly we have the resources if people would cough them up. But could we actually have the inspiration to do that? And you think about it, and you look back to those beautiful medieval churches that were built, and they were built with the generosity of the people of means, and then they were open to the faithful. They were open to everybody, paupers alike, who could come into the church and they could pray. Because it wasn't something being built so that I can say, look at this great thing, and I'm going to put my name on it. Right? People like to do that when they build churches. We're going to put our name on it. See, I did that. Some of the old churches, they've got the pews, right, with the little gate and the family name on it, so nobody can take your seat. You can show up last minute, and it's like, look, I got my Delta 365, seats at church. They don't, come around with concessions, though. But to be able to give just of our own generosity because it's for the glory of God. This is beautiful, and it costs like $300, I think. That's all it cost. It was cheap. It's paint, it's fabric, it's some wood, and it was dozens of dedicated hours of sweat and I hope no blood, maybe tears. We look at that, and on Friday I was telling people, look, this is just a nice little, taste of what a church could feel like, but, I have to probably build some $20 million church. And afterwards, someone said to me, why do we have to always talk about, building a $20 million church? We don't need a cathedral. To which I said, you're right, we don't need a cathedral because that would probably be like $50 or $60 million. But then there's the response of, well, but I won't be here to see it. I won't be here to see it. The Cathedral of the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona has been under construction for over 100 years. It's still got a couple of decades probably to go to finish. The architect, Antonio Gaudí, he died and he destroyed all the plans so that Franco wouldn't come in and do stuff. Actually, it wasn't Franco, it was the communists. Franco was on the side of the church. But it's still going, right? The Duomo, 400 years. The beautiful cathedral in Cologne, Germany, centuries. Because it's not this idea of I'm giving so that I have something, right? I'm paying for a transaction so that I can have nicer amenities at my club. I'm willing to pay an increased, membership due to have nicer amenities at the club. But rather it's I'm giving freely because I'm not attached to this. I'm attached to God. And I want to give what I have that I can so that God may be glorified. It's just a little primer on tithing. Let's try to keep that and poverty separate. But ultimately, poverty is that which disconnects us from the world and connects us more and more to God. It's much more difficult to be connected to God when we've got stuff. I mean, think about it even when y'all were kids, right? How much simpler things were. I think about it when I was in middle school and when I wanted to listen to music and I had to either get my sister to make me a mixtape, which she was an expert at starting and stopping the record from the radio to without any commercials or any announcement, right? And then I got a little older and, okay, well, Mom, can I get on the internet? Remember when we had to ask to get on the internet? Mom, can I get on the internet? No, I have an important phone call coming. We weren't like the rich kids that had two phone lines in their house so that they could, use the internet whenever. And then you get on the internet, right, and it's like, all right, dial up, and it takes 20 minutes maybe to finally get a connection, and then I'm going to download a song on Napster, and it's going to take forever. I might have to let it run overnight and hope that nothing happens to the connection. And now we can just pull out our iPhone or our Android and just open up Spotify, and there it is. And we're like, oh, come on, it's taking like 3 seconds to buffer. This is crazy. Gosh, how hard we had it back then, right? But if we think about just kind of those, all the modern things, niceties, we can have like pretty much anything we want. In fact, Friday night, Father Michael and I were watching some awful Tommy Lee Jones movie. Anyway, the Amazon Fire Cube that I have that's like 6 years old is slowing down, and it takes forever to load something. And so I'm like, I don't want to deal with this anymore. So what do? I order me up a new Fire TV stick. It's $40, right? It's 8 o'clock at night on a Friday. Saturday at 9 a.m. at my door is this Fire Stick, and it's already loaded with all my stuff. Just plug it right in, right? We got everything we need. Or do we? Does that stuff constrict us? Kind of material obsession, whereby we look to this stuff and we say, gosh, I need it. It makes my life easier, right? I need it because it makes me comfortable. I need it because it makes me happy. What if it all went away tomorrow, right? What if the Chinese or the Russians shot a giant EMP at us and none of our electronics worked anymore? Would we know what to do? We'd probably be kind of scratching our heads. A lot of people would probably come to church. We'd have candles, right? And we'd be like, how long is this going to be? When's it going to come back? Maybe we'd have to rediscover, right, kind of who we are, who God is. How do we live our lives without stuff, disconnected? So poverty is a very important counsel because it helps us to recognize that we are called to trust in the Lord completely, right? We try to control things. We check our bank account. We look at our cameras, to check on things, check our investments, check all the stuff. Are we really in control of it, though? No, we're not. So poverty, chastity. Chastity kind of flows forth from poverty. Because we live in such a morally impoverished time, chastity is something that is laughed at, that is mocked, right? We hear that word and we're like, yeah, it's kind of antiquated and old-fashioned, right? Yeah, okay, there's the nuns that they make a vow of chastity, and so they live chastely, and there's the priests that they're celibate, so great. But that doesn't really apply to anybody else. When in fact, all of us are called to live chastity. Even married couples are called to live chastity, right? You can ask a married couple if they are more frequently chaste or not, and I bet those that aren't married would be surprised. Oh, it's much more frequent that they're chaste. Chastity is a very important virtue because it moderates our passions. Much like in poverty, we're not seeking just pleasure, we're not seeking just gratitude, but we're ultimately seeking the love of God. We live in a time in which chastity is just kind of pushed aside. And you know what? Let's not worry about it, right? Let's not worry about attacks on the family. Let's not worry about attacks on gender. Let's not worry about, redefinitions of marriage. Let's not worry about any of that stuff, right? Let people do what they want, and that's fine. But that hurts our society. It harms our culture. It impoverishes us more. It pushes us away from God. And so chastity is such an important virtue. And it's the one that people get the most mad about when we talk about it too, right? Telling people who have been married and divorced, and it may have been a horrible, awful first marriage and divorce, but people often, they'll use that to kind of justify, well, I can do whatever I want now, right? I don't need anybody telling me, who I can or can't love. When in reality, marriage is, till death do us part. We can't just get a piece of paper and say, this marriage is over. The marriage might be very broken, very hurt and suffering. And the suffering that the persons are experiencing may be very real. In fact, it is. But just because of that, we can't say, well, the rules don't apply to me now because I want to be happy. All the more we have to impoverish ourselves so that we may trust in the Lord. All the more we have to set aside our own will, our own wants. I'm in this incredibly difficult situation, but I need to do the will of God. And we can go back through history, right? Go all the way back to Abraham, right? Hey, Sarah is your wife, not Hagar, right? Go to King David. Hey, Bathsheba's not your wife. Go to Herod and John the Baptist, and John the Baptist saying, hey, that's not your wife, that's your brother's wife. He got killed. Then there's my patron saint, St. Stanislaus in Poland, who tells King Boleslaw, hey, you can't have your brother's wife as your wife because she's your brother's wife. Stanislaus gets killed. And then there's this, dude in England who thinks he can do whatever he wants. And, people are like, oh, why do you talk about this? Come on, this is such an awkward topic. Protestantism was literally made up because of this rejection of chastity. Because King Henry was selfish. We see examples throughout history of it, whereby a rejection of chastity is ultimately a rejection of God. And then finally, that brings us to obedience. Because, okay, you tell me I have to be impoverished, and you tell me I have to be chaste. Why? Well, because the bark of Peter, the church that Christ founded, that he put his Holy Spirit over to guide us. Because it's that church that tells us, that calls us, this is how we ought to live. This is the way in which we ought to live a life of holiness. This is the way in which we will grow in virtue. To not do it will cause harm, not just to yourself, but others. So the church calls us to obey. All of us are called to obedience, no matter what, right? For those of you that are parents at home, who maybe in your own mind you're like, well, no, I can do whatever I want. I don't care what the church says. I'm just going to do me. How does that work out when your kids do that? And they tell you, no, these are the rules. These are my rules. They're different rules from other people, but my rules are okay, right? My sister, she has to follow your rules, but I'm going to follow my rules. It gets messy. And so obedience is a necessary virtue. It humbles us, right? Because sometimes we don't understand, right? Mom and dad are just saying, hey, just do as I say. Obedience is difficult because sometimes it goes against what we think we ought to be doing, right? Obedience is difficult because it means we have to set aside our own will. Christ was obedient to the Father. He was obedient up to death on the cross. And so that obedience is so essential for us. And so on this feast day of St. Clare of Assisi, we recognize in our own lives the ways to which we are called to trust more and more in God, to not take our gaze off of Him, to not look around us for the material world like Peter did, but to trust in Him. And then as St. Clare did, to live a life that is faithful, to live a life in which she is able to follow the evangelical counsels, to embrace poverty that leads us closer to Christ, that helps us to know Him better, embracing that chastity that frees us to love God, and embracing that poverty that enables us to do His will. And so on this feast day, let us ask for the intercession of St. Clare of Assisi, that each and every one of us may be able to live and do God's will in our lives, and that we may be able to reject that of the world, so that we may continue on our journey through the sea of this world in the bark of Peter, and that we may ultimately be united one day with St. Clare, with St. Francis, with all the angels and saints, and that we may all be united in heaven for eternity before our Almighty Father.